Okay, so now that we've looked at vertical integration, now we're going to look at horizontal integration, which was another key business innovation of the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, vertical integration was about controlling different aspects of production, right? And in the case of steel, if we go back to that slide, right, it was about vertically integrating, right? You manufacture steel, you buy the railroad that ships the raw material, in this case iron, you buy the ships on the Great Lakes that transport it to the railway, and then you buy the iron mine itself, and you do the same thing with coal, right? It's vertical. It's moving like this. Horizontal integration is combining several competing companies in the same industry. So let's say this is you, oil company B, right? You integrate horizontally by then buying up the competition. So you create this massive company, not through vertical integration, by the combination of different aspects of the production process, whether it be backward toward production in the case of raw materials like steel, or forward toward the market in the case of the tobacco industry and the meatpacking industry. Horizontal integration was about buying up the competition and integrating horizontally. So you can see how it's different in this sense. If we go back to that other slide we had here, right? Vertical, right? So again, the example we're using is oil. So if this is an oil company, instead of going up, vertically up and down in terms of controlling the production process, it goes this way. So what they're doing is buying companies that also manufacture oil, right? Not buying, say, companies that sell oil or distribute it, right? Or in the case of steel, it would be about buying other steel companies. Now, this is key as well. It wasn't one or the other. Most of these corporations did both. Some vertically integrated earlier, and then horizontally integrated. Others horizontally integrated first and then integrated vertically second. So let's go back to our horizontally integrated slide here. So if we want to think about what horizontal integration is, the key area that we're going to look at is oil refining, U.S. Steel, and also United States Sugar Company. And again, I think it's good to look at U.S. Steel because it demonstrates that steel was an industry that vertically integrated, but then it also horizontally integrates. So let's start by thinking about, I guess we can look at sugar, right? So if we look at the U.S. Sugar Company, what you see here is the U.S. Sugar Company essentially emerged as a combination of different companies: U.S. Refining, Colonial Sugar, American Refining, and Cane Sugar. All of these companies combined into one company to sell sugar. It created massive corporations. Now, the other example that we're going to look at, I think, before we get into oil, because it's kind of the key example, is we'll go back and look at steel, right? So this was the example of steel vertically integrating. But if we think of steel, eventually, what we will get is the horizontal integration of the steel industry. So if we look at Carnegie and Homestead Steel, by 1900, Carnegie Steel employed 20,000 people and was the world's largest industrial company. So successful that Carnegie's competitors sought to buy him out. So like the railroad industry, it was massively consolidated. And again, here's our old friend, J.P. Morgan, comes in 1901, bought Andrew Carnegie's companies and reorganized them into the United States Steel Corporation. It was the first corporation capitalized at $1 billion. It employed 168,000 people and was made up of 200 companies. It was absolutely massive. So this is, again, now you have a vertically and horizontally integrated company, and you can imagine how massive this corporation was, right? Not only did it control all aspects of production, going back to mining, shipping, railway, and the production of steel, but now it owned all other different kinds of steel companies. As we said, up to 200 different companies, many of whom were also vertically integrated. So you can then imagine how large this web, this network of a corporate colossus that U.S. Steel was. So large that for those of you that have ever seen the movie The Godfather, in Godfather Part 2, there's this line where one of the characters says, he's referring to the mafia, he says, "We're larger than U.S. Steel." And it just goes to show you how large U.S. Steel was as a corporation, that it was something to compare yourself to, that if you said you were larger than U.S. Steel, it meant you were absolutely massive. Now, one of the other key examples when we look at horizontal integration is the oil industry. The true pioneer, really, of horizontal integration was J.D. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Now, the oil industry in the United States dates back to 1859, when oil was found in Pennsylvania, and there was a rush to make money. And finally, Standard Oil integrated itself vertically to control all aspects of production, but then he starts horizontally integrating by buying out and forcing out his competitors. If a local competitors refused his offers to buy them out, he would price his products below the market rate and take a loss if necessary to drive them out of business or to drive it so low that they had no choice but to sell to him. If his rivals teamed up against him and set up a pool agreement among several other companies that established production and fixed quotas, he would then start to buy them out. By 1879, he controlled 90% of the oil industry. And this is Standard Oil. Okay, just a massive, massive corporation. And also what the oil industry pioneered was something that's referred to as trusts. Now, I'm not going to get into the detail of what trusts are, but it essentially creates a monopoly. And this is what the combined effects of vertical and horizontal integration did, is it created monopolistic industries. And again, if we think of the example of US Steel, 200 corporations were now one corporation, both vertically and horizontally integrated. In the case of Standard Oil, something that had already vertically integrated, right? By 1880, 90% of the oil market in the United States was controlled by Standard Oil. That is an example of a monopoly. But what Rockefeller also did was pioneer the use of what's referred to as trusts. Now, what a trust was essentially the pool agreement that he used. He had this idea to use a pool of other companies to kind of control costs and set production. And what this did was he allowed him to control nearly 40 separate companies controlled by one company, in this case Rockefeller. But the pool agreement initially was set up through verbal agreements and cross-shareholding. And this was because these pool agreements were secret. They lacked legal authority. It was essentially a way of controlling the industry initially that was somewhat illegal. But in 1882, Rockefeller and his associates further monopolized his control over the oil industry when they created the Standard Oil Trust. The pool agreement, as I said, lacked legal authority, but the trust created an umbrella company that ran all 40, and they moved their offices to New York City. Chandler talks about this a little bit in the reading. So what Rockefeller and his associates did was they persuaded the stockholders of 40 companies to exchange their stock for a trust certificate. This agreement allowed their share of the trust profits while enabling the trust to control production of the business. This helped reduce costs, but it also meant the entire U.S. oil industry was controlled by the Standard Oil Trust. Now, this was also done in other industries as well, most other industries. Duke also does it, and he creates the American Tobacco Company in 1890, which is a vertically and horizontally integrated company. Now, one key thing happens. So what we have here is monopolistic business practices. You have these corporations integrating vertically and horizontally to essentially control the entire industry. And when the trust comes along, it allows a holding company, often based in New York City, to control many other companies, right? In the case of Standard Oil, it was 40 companies. And in the case of US Steel, you're talking about 200 separate companies that are often controlled by a small holding company that is usually headquartered in New York City, or at least a place like New York City. Now, of course, at this point, the US government starts to become concerned. Right? If capitalism, if we go back to our Adam Smith, is supposed to be about competition leading to innovation to reduce costs, well, now we've got the kind of opposite approach here, right? We have monopoly established not through intervention of the state, but by a lack of intervention in the state, that these monopolistic practices emerged out of this kind of freewheeling free market. That what was a free market by the late 19th and early 20th century was far from a free market, right? When the entire sector of one economy, in the case of oil, is controlled, at least 90% of that industry is controlled by one company, right? That doesn't exactly allow for fair competition. And that's a lot of what these trusts also did. They ensured that competition didn't get out of control, that there were agreements on how much you could sell something. It wasn't about underselling somebody per se. It was about controlling your costs of production so that you didn't get competition leading to reduces in price. You got, in this case, a very small group of people, sometimes one person, controlling an entire industry. So in 1890, the United States passes the Sherman Antitrust Act to stop monopolistic business practices. But it largely fails to do anything. in the 1890s. It's not until the early 20th century, initially under President Theodore Roosevelt, but also under William Howard Taft. In 1911, the U.S. government succeeded in breaking up Standard Oil and many of these other companies. American Tobacco was also broken up in 1911. Now, again, just to give you an example of the scale and size of these corporations, here is Standard Oil, founded by J.D. Rockefeller, okay? These are all the companies that currently exist that were part of Standard Oil, right? So when it's broken up in 1911, Standard Oil of New Jersey becomes Esso. Standard Oil of California will eventually become Chevron. Standard Oil of New York becomes Mobil, which will then later combine with Esso to become Exxon Mobil, right? So Standard Oil of New Jersey becomes Exxon. Standard Oil of Indiana and the Standard Oil Company of Ohio will eventually be combined to become British Petroleum. Standard Ohio Company will eventually become Marathon, which doesn't exist anymore. It was bought out. But these companies here, ExxonMobil and British Petroleum, are amongst the largest corporations in the world, rivaled only by like Walmart. But 125, 150 years ago, these were all one company. That just gives you an example of how big Standard Oil actually was. So this is a good place to end, because what we're seeing is the beginning of this massive industrial revolution. The fact that you had this very freewheeling market that, despite creating more competition, actually led to convergence and consolidation and created first monopolistic companies in the case of U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. And then by 1911, the U.S. government breaks up these massive companies and they become oligopolies, where you don't have one company controlling an entire industry, but in this particular case, say a few companies that control the industry. And this is a good place to leave off and to look forward to next week, where we see a different phase of late capitalism. This is kind of the hyper free market late capitalism, which ironically doesn't really lead to a free market. It leads to monopolistic and oligopolistic industries. But now that the US government is taking an active role in breaking up in 1911, is a good way to leave off for the next class, when we start talking about the era of state-backed capitalism of the 20th century. This is the capitalism of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. We'll also look at different aspects of Fordism, the way companies tried to run their production operations by consensus rather than conflict. I mean, one of the things I haven't talked about so much this lecture that we'll talk more about next class is that you had massive labor disruptions with these massive companies, right? Violence. The army was called in to put down strikes. In 1877 alone, you had thousands of strikes take place. And we'll talk a bit more about that next class. But by the mid-20th century, which is where we're moving to now, we're going to start to see business operating more under consensus and the creation of what David Harvey calls embedded liberalism, moving away from the kind of laissez-faire free market capitalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.